The morning started ordinary. That's what would haunt Derek Simmons later. He didn't understand the moment he was walking into. Tuesday, 7:14 a.m. The kind of time that appears in police reports and news broadcasts forever frozen as the moment everything shifted. Rosie's Diner sat on the corner of Elm and 4th in suburban Ohio, a place that had existed for 60 years without incident, without drama, without knowing that it was about to become a sanctuary that refused to be violated. The diner itself was a time capsule. Red vinyl booths with chrome legs that had seen thousands of conversations. A long counter with rotating stools worn smooth by decades of people sitting, waiting, talking. The kind of place where regulars knew the waitstaff by name, where the coffee was always hot, where the pie was made fresh daily by a woman named Helen who'd been baking in that kitchen since 1983. The walls were covered with photographs, old pictures of Akron, the industrial days when steel mills dominated the skyline, the railroad station, the tire factories, images of a community that had built something real, something tangible, something that mattered to the nation. Those photographs were witnesses to change, to the rise and fall of industries, to the persistence of ordinary people through extraordinary upheaval. Reverend Marcus Williams pushed through the glass doors at exactly 7:16 a.m. He'd been coming to this diner for 3 years, not for the food, not for the coffee, though it was decent enough. Marcus came here because it was the one place in his week where he could be just a man, not a pastor, just a person ordering breakfast, not someone carrying the weight of 500 lives on his shoulders. At 52 years old, Marcus had earned the right to quiet moments. His body bore the marks of a life lived fully, silver threading through his close-cropped hair and beard, lines around his eyes that spoke of 3 decades spent looking into the darkest corners of human nature. 30 years. That's how long he'd served before the ministry, federal service, the kind of work that teaches you to read people the way others read newspapers, to understand threat instinctively, to recognize when the temperature in a room has shifted imperceptibly but unmistakably. His federal career had been in criminal investigation, organized crime primarily. He'd worked cases that spanned years, cases that required patience, attention to detail, the ability to sit with discomfort and confusion until patterns emerged from seeming chaos. He'd testified in federal court 17 times. He'd received commendations. He'd been the kind of agent that other agents came to when they needed to understand something complex. But the work had taken something from him too. It had taken his legs, not directly, not in some dramatic moment of violence, but in a car accident during a surveillance operation. A moment of inattention that lasted less than a second. A truck running a red light. And Marcus's life transformed from the possibility of a full career to the reality of a wheelchair. The recovery had been brutal. Not just physical, though that was hard enough, but emotional, spiritual. The loss of the future he'd imagined, the loss of independence, the loss of the assumption that his body would do what he asked of it. But somewhere in that recovery, Marcus had found something, a kind of clarity, a recognition that his purpose hadn't ended, it had simply transformed. He'd spent his federal career looking into darkness. Maybe it was time to carry light instead. Maybe it was time to be present to people in their own difficult moments. Maybe it was time to listen more than he'd ever done before. He'd left federal service at 48 years old against the advice of colleagues who told him he was throwing away a pension, throwing away a career trajectory. But Marcus had made his decision. He'd gone back to school. He'd gotten his divinity degree. He'd done the work to become an ordained pastor. And 5 years ago, he'd been called to Bethel Grace Church. His posture was still military precise. Even seated in a wheelchair, the result of that accident sustained during those 30 years of service, Marcus carried himself with the bearing of someone who had stared down organized crime syndicates, who had confronted international terrorists, who understood that authority was something you earned, not something you could demand with a badge and a uniform. But that Tuesday morning, Marcus wasn't thinking about authority or threat. He was thinking about basil, fresh basil which his daughter wanted for a recipe she'd found in some cooking magazine. His daughter was studying at Ohio State. She was the first in their family to go to college. She was brilliant. She wanted to be a food scientist. And last Sunday she'd called and asked him to pick up fresh basil because she wanted to experiment with different preservation methods. He was also thinking about the newspaper, the Akron Beacon Journal. There was an article he wanted to read about the school board's decision on funding for the elementary schools in the primarily black neighborhoods. Marcus kept track of these things. He believed that if you were going to lead a community, you needed to understand the systems affecting that community. The education system, the health system, the criminal justice system. All of it interconnected. All of it affecting his 500 people. The waitress knew him. Her name was Susan, though they'd never formally introduced themselves. 3 years of Tuesday mornings creates a kind of understanding that goes beyond names. She smiled when he came in, already reaching for the coffee pot. She was in her 50s with the kind of tired warmth that comes from decades of genuine customer service. Susan wasn't performing friendliness. She'd simply developed the capacity to see people, really see them, and to treat that seeing as sacred work. "Usual booth?" she asked. "Please," Marcus said. He settled into the corner booth, the one with the view of the street. Even in moments of peace, even in his sanctuary, Marcus's mind maintained the operational awareness that 30 years of federal service had burned into his neurology. He tracked the delivery truck turning the corner 2 blocks away. He noted the young mother with a stroller walking on the opposite side of the street. He observed everything. It was habit, automatic, neurological. His federal training had taught him to notice patterns, small things that most people ignored, the way someone walked, the positioning of their shoulders, whether they made eye contact, whether their breathing was normal. These things told stories if you knew how to read them. He was aware that this constant vigilance wasn't necessarily healthy. His therapist had mentioned it. The neurologist he'd seen after his accident had mentioned it. The pastor he'd worked with during his own spiritual recovery had definitely mentioned it. But Marcus couldn't seem to turn it off. It was part of who he'd become, part of the price of the work he'd done. Bethel Grace Church was in his thoughts, the congregation that had become his true calling. 500 people. That's what the rolls said, though. On any given Sunday, about 430 actually showed up. Teachers and nurses, mechanics and custodians, the working backbone of Akron. People who worked hard, who'd built this city through their labor, who deserved dignity and respect and community. They'd chosen to trust him with their spiritual lives, and Marcus took that trust seriously in ways that transcended the traditional boundaries of ministry. He was there at 3 a.m. when someone's child had been arrested on drug charges. He was present at hospital beds when the diagnosis came back terminal. He sat with families when fathers left. He celebrated with couples when babies arrived. He knew every name, every story, every fear and hope that circulated through his congregation. They'd chosen him because somewhere along the way Marcus had learned that the most powerful thing a leader could do was simply show up. Not with answers, not with authority, just with presence and witness and refusal to look away when things became difficult. He didn't know it yet, but in less than 30 minutes, Derek Simmons would arrive at Rosie's Diner. Derek had been thinking about Marcus for weeks, not obsessively, not in the way that consumed his every thought, but the way a problem consumes your thinking in the background. Persistent and nagging, like a tooth that aches when you bite down in a certain way. You learn to avoid biting that way, but you never forget the ache. Derek was 34 years old, thick-necked and broad-shouldered in a way that the police uniform somehow made more imposing. He was the kind of man who'd grown up believing certain things about the world, beliefs about order, about hierarchy, about who belonged where, about the proper arrangement of society. He gripped his steering wheel with white knuckles, his mirrored sunglasses reflecting the early morning light as he drove his patrol car through the neighborhoods he was supposed to protect. But protection was a complicated word for Derek. He didn't see his role as protecting these neighborhoods. He saw his role as controlling them, as reminding people that authority existed and that they needed to respect it. Derek had been on the force for 8 years. The department had logged 13 excessive force complaints against him in that time. 11 of those involved people of color. Every single one had been resolved through union settlements, through technicalities, through a police department that had learned long ago how to make problems disappear when those problems wore a badge with a name like Simmons. There was a saying in the department, "Protect your own." And Derek had learned early that he could rely on that protection. There was a network, an understanding, a shared code that meant officers protected each other, not openly, not explicitly, but through the subtle mechanisms of institutional power, through complaints that got lost in filing systems, through witnesses who suddenly couldn't remember details, through supervisors who looked the other way. Derek understood the game better than most. He knew which supervisors wouldn't ask questions. He knew which corners had camera blind spots. He'd spent 3 years learning the geography of blind spots. He knew how to write a report that transformed the victim into the aggressor, the accused into the defender. He had survived because he'd learned to operate within the system's architecture, using its own mechanisms to protect himself. His partner during his early years on the force, officer Tom Michaels, had taught him the fundamentals. Tom was older, 20 years on the job, with a wisdom about institutional survival that Derek had absorbed like a sponge. Tom had shown him how to position himself during traffic stops so that the dash cam couldn't capture certain actions. Tom had shown him how to use the radio strategically. Tom had shown him how to write reports in ways that were technically accurate but fundamentally misleading. When Tom retired, Derek had found other mentors. Officers who understood that the uniform was permission. Permission to do things you couldn't do in civilian life. Permission to exercise power. Permission to enforce not just law, but the invisible social hierarchy that made people like Derek feel secure. But there was something darker than even his record suggested. Derek carried a bitterness that had nothing to do with public safety. Everything to do with the world that was changing around him in ways he couldn't control. He watched neighborhoods where black businesses were opening, where pastors and community leaders held authority that had nothing to do with a badge. He saw families building lives that surpassed his own. His own father had worked in the steel mills, had been part of the industrial working class that made Akron a city of consequence. But the mills had closed, the economy had shifted, and suddenly, the skills his father had developed over 40 years were worthless. His father had spent his final years unemployed, bitter, watching younger people navigate an economy he didn't understand. Derek had grown up in that atmosphere of decline. His mother working as a hotel maid, his father angry and drinking more than was good for him. The sense that something had been stolen from his family, from his community, from the white working class that had once built this nation. And now watching neighborhoods where black people were opening businesses, where black pastors were building community wealth, where black lawyers were opening practices. Derek felt it all again, that sense of displacement, that sense that things that should have belonged to people like him were being taken by people who didn't deserve them. He witnessed a transformation that made him feel powerless. And powerless men do dangerous things. For 3 weeks, Derek had been coming to this neighborhood to watch, to study, to identify the problems that needed solving. And he'd identified one problem in particular, Reverend Marcus Williams, a black man with more authority in his community than Derek would ever have. A man whose congregation trusted him more than they trusted the police. A man who represented everything Derek feared. the loss of the invisible hierarchy that had always protected men like him. So Derek had a plan. Nothing dramatic, nothing that would leave evidence. Just a moment of confrontation that would remind this pastor, and by extension, his entire community who held the real power. Just a demonstration of the cost of stepping out of line. Just a reminder that authority, real authority, came from the badge and the gun and the network of men who wore them. Derek had learned that violence didn't have to be physical to be effective. The most powerful violence was institutional. It was the violence of systems, of processes, of mechanisms that ground you down slowly, making it impossible to achieve anything, to build anything, to be anything. At 7:47 a.m., Derek Simmons pushed through the doors of Rosie's Diner. Marcus looked up from his newspaper as the bell above the door chimed. He had trained himself not to assume threat automatically. Not every police officer was a problem. Not every moment required tactical assessment. But something in his nervous system registered the shift immediately, a change in atmospheric pressure that most people wouldn't consciously perceive. It was subtle. The way the light caught differently, the way the air moved, the way the other people in the diner seemed to hold their breath. Derek's eyes locked onto Marcus across the diner. Not a casual glance, an intentional sightline, a greeting between two people who both understood that something significant was about to occur. Derek hadn't come to this diner by accident. He'd been planning this moment, rehearsing it mentally, imagining how it would go, how Marcus would respond, how the dynamic would shift once Derek established his dominance. The waitress had frozen mid-pour, her hand hovering over a coffee cup. The couple in the corner booth exchanged a glance. Something in the air had changed. People recognized it instinctively, the recognition of a predator entering a space. Derek ordered his coffee with casual precision. Black. To go. He didn't acknowledge Marcus. He didn't need to. The order was performance, a way of establishing that he was in control of the environment, that he could move through this space as he pleased, that his presence alone was significant enough to shift the entire dynamic of the diner. This was what Derek understood. Presence. The power of a uniform. The power of implicit threat. But then something unexpected happened. Derek didn't leave. He turned coffee cup in hand and walked directly toward Marcus's booth. This was the moment he'd been planning. This was where he would establish his authority, where he would demonstrate that even a man of God needed to understand limits, needed to understand that in this territory, Derek's authority superseded anything else. "You," Derek said. "You need to leave." His tone wasn't aggressive. Not yet. It was conversational, the kind of tone a person uses when they're issuing a command they expect to be obeyed without question, the kind of tone that assumes compliance. Marcus set down his newspaper slowly. He'd been in enough difficult situations to understand the anatomy of confrontation. This was the opening move. This was Derek establishing that he could issue orders that would be obeyed. This was about compliance. This was about the submission of another's will to his own. "I'm having coffee," Marcus said. His voice was level, not defiant, not challenging, just stating a fact. But in that simplicity was a refusal to accept the implicit command, a refusal to acknowledge Derek's authority. "Not in this diner," Derek said, "not while I'm in here." The words hung in the air like a physical challenge. Derek was establishing territorial dominance. This was his space now. Marcus was only here because Derek permitted it, and Derek was withdrawing that permission. Susan the waitress moved slightly, as if she might intervene, but Derek's body language suggested that intervention could become complicated. The positioning of his shoulders, the way his hand rested near his belt, the subtle changes in his stance that suggested an escalation was possible. Marcus didn't move. He didn't reach for his coffee. He didn't avert his eyes. He simply existed in the space he occupied, refusing the implied order to vacate. This was a moment of crucial importance. This was where Marcus was making a choice. The choice to assert his own autonomy, to refuse the demand to disappear. Why, Marcus asked. It was such a simple question. It was so reasonable. It should have been impossible to refuse. But Derek understood what Marcus had understood from the moment their eyes met. This wasn't really a question. This was a test. Marcus was asking Derek to justify his authority, to articulate a reason for an order that had none. And in asking for justification, Marcus was asserting that authority needed justification, that Derek's uniform didn't automatically grant him the right to demand compliance. "Because I said so," Derek responded. The words hung in the diner air like a physical thing. "Because I said so." The language of someone accustomed to absolute compliance. The vocabulary of someone who had never been required to explain himself. Derek had spent 8 years operating in a system where his commands were presumed to be legitimate, where people obeyed because they feared him, or because they understood that resistance would be costly, or because they had been taught their entire lives that authority figures were not to be questioned. Marcus was quiet for a moment. He was running calculations in his mind, old calculations from his federal days, assessing threat levels, understanding the psychology of the person in front of him. Derek wanted submission. Derek wanted the satisfaction of commanding someone to leave and having them obey. The power of that moment would sustain Derek for weeks. It would validate his belief in his own authority. When he spoke again, his voice was steady, but there was something in it, a tone that suggested he understood exactly what was happening. "That's not a reason," Marcus said. Derek's jaw tightened. His face began to flush, not from physical exertion, but from the unfamiliar sensation of being questioned. Derek's entire career had been built on the assumption that his uniform granted him authority that extended beyond law and into the realm of pure dominance. People obeyed because they feared him, or because they understood that resistance would be costly, or because they had been taught their entire lives that authority figures were not to be questioned. But Marcus wasn't obeying. Marcus was asking for justification. Marcus was treating Derek's command as if it were negotiable, as if authority required reasoning, as if Derek didn't automatically hold power just by virtue of the badge and the uniform. Derek's hand moved to his belt, not to his weapon but to the apparatus of authority, his radio, his cuffs, the implements of control. He stood up from the counter and began walking toward Marcus's booth. This was escalating. This was moving from verbal confrontation to something physical. This was Derek preparing to arrest a man for the crime of refusing to leave a public diner. The tension in the diner became almost unbearable. The other customers had stopped pretending not to notice. A young couple several booths away had paused mid-conversation. An elderly man by the window had put down his fork. Everyone understood that something was happening, something that might cross a line, something that might become violent. Derek approached the booth. His hand went to his belt, and for a moment, just a fraction of a second, it seemed like this was going to become something violent, like Derek was going to arrest this man, like the morning was going to end with chaos. Marcus understood the possibility. He was preparing himself mentally, running through scenarios, understanding that in this moment he had very limited control. But then Susan moved. The waitress stepped directly between Derek and Marcus's booth. Not aggressively, not confrontationally, just physically, placing herself between a man in authority and someone who might become a victim of that authority. It was a simple gesture, an act of moral clarity, a refusal to witness injustice without intervening. "I think you should leave, officer," she said quietly. The spell broke. Derek's hand froze. His face went through a rapid cycle of emotions: shock, anger, calculation, realization. He'd been challenged not just by a black man he'd intended to dominate, but by a white woman in front of witnesses. He understood in that moment what had shifted. There were cameras in this diner. Most diners had them now. for security purposes, for liability purposes, for the simple documentation of daily life. Derek had learned to work around camera angles. He knew where they couldn't see. But this moment of public challenge was being witnessed in multiple ways, not just by the people in the diner, but by the machines recording everything, by the social contract that made certain actions unacceptable when witnessed. There were people watching. There was documentation occurring whether he could see it or not. And Derek understood in that moment that the rules of his game had changed. He could not arrest this man. Not now. Not in front of witnesses. The narrative would be wrong. The story would not support his authority. The system might not protect him from this particular angle. Derek's hand dropped from his belt. "You know what he said?" His voice cold and controlled. "I'm filing a report with the health department. This place is disgusting. And you, Pastor, I know every officer on every force within 50 miles. You'll never get the protection you need. You need something. You call for help. You might find us very slow to respond." He threw his coffee cup into the trash with deliberate force. The impact was sharp, audible, a physical punctuation mark on his threat. The door chimed as he left, but the sound was somehow different this time, less like an opening and more like a closing, less like the beginning of something and more like the ending of something. The diner fell silent. Marcus sat very still for a long moment. His hands, which had remained perfectly calm throughout the confrontation, began to tremble. Not from fear, from something deeper. From the violation of a space that had been sacred. From the understanding that even in moments of peace, even in places of refuge, authority could reach in and contaminate what you'd built. The diner felt different now, changed. The light seemed harsher, the sounds sharper. The walls that had provided sanctuary now felt exposed. Derek had come in and marked this space with his presence, with his threat, with his refusal to acknowledge boundaries. Susan approached slowly. She was also trembling slightly. The adrenaline of the moment was hitting her now. The reality of what had happened, of the way she'd inserted herself between danger and innocence, of the risk she'd taken without calculating it. "I'm so sorry," she said. "I'm so sorry about that." Marcus looked up at her. He had trained himself to keep the pastoral voice steady, the professional demeanor intact, even when his interior world was shifting, even when his nervous system was running through scenarios, even when part of him wanted to respond to the threat with force, with the tactical precision that 30 years of federal training had encoded into his muscles and bones. "You did exactly right," he said. "Thank you." He finished his coffee. It tasted different now. Everything had changed. Not in his mouth, but in his understanding of what this moment meant. Derek's threat wasn't random. Derek wasn't simply an officer having a bad day. Derek had targeted him specifically. Derek had come to this diner knowing Marcus would be here. Derek had orchestrated this moment with deliberate intention. And Derek's threat was more sophisticated than simple physical violence. Derek was threatening the system itself, the network of protection that was supposed to keep Marcus and his community safe. The police, the authority figures who were supposed to help when help was needed. Derek was weaponizing that system. He was saying without saying it explicitly that Marcus's community would be abandoned by that system, would be left vulnerable, would face slow response times or no response times when they called for help. It was institutional threat, the most effective kind, the kind that works at the level of the nervous system. That creates a kind of psychological siege that makes you understand your vulnerability, that makes you understand that the systems you thought protected you might actually threaten you. Marcus left a large tip for Susan, 2 20s instead of his usual 10. As he wheeled himself toward the door, his mind was already working through the implications. This wasn't about Marcus as an individual. This was about Marcus as a symbol. Derek hadn't been threatened by a man in a wheelchair. Derek had been threatened by a man who had authority in his community that had nothing to do with a badge. He was threatened by Marcus's congregation, by the 500 people who trusted Marcus, by the community that had chosen him, by the collective power that came from mutual loyalty and shared purpose. That was what Derek was really afraid of. That was what Derek was trying to suppress. That was what Derek's threat was designed to undermine. And that's exactly when Marcus made his decision. A decision that would have consequences that Derek never anticipated. A decision that would prove to be the catalyst for something much larger than a single incident in a diner. By Wednesday morning, Bethel Grace Church's fellowship hall was filled with more people than usual. The weekly Bible study had been rescheduled, expanded, transformed into something else entirely. A gathering where people brought not scripture but stories, where voices came to testify not about faith, but about survival, about the cost of living in a community where authority could stop you without reason, where your presence could be treated as suspicious, where your safety could not be guaranteed. Marcus sat at the front, and after allowing a few moments of settling, he asked a question that would change everything. Has anyone else had experiences with Officer Derek Simmons? The silence that followed was the silence of recognition. It was the silence of people realizing they were not alone in something they'd been carrying privately. It was the silence of a burden being shared, of a secret becoming common knowledge, of individual experiences suddenly connecting into a larger pattern. One hand went up, then another, then a third, then a fourth. By the time the count was complete, 6 hands were raised. 6 people in his congregation who had been targeted. 6 people who had stories to tell. 6 people who had been waiting for the space to tell them. A woman named Dorothy stood first. She was in her 50s, wore her dignity like armor, and had worked as a teacher for 20 years. She taught 3rd grade at Buchtel Elementary. She was beloved by her students. She had photographs from her classroom on the walls of her home, drawings that children had made for her. Thank you cards. Evidence of the impact she had on young lives. 3 months ago, Dorothy began, I was pulled over on my way home from work. Officer Simmons said I had a broken taillight. My taillight is not broken. I had it checked by my mechanic the day before. But Derek pulled me over anyway. He spent 20 minutes asking me questions. Where did I work? Was I married? Did I go to church? Did my family own property? Then he let me go. No citation, no warning, just letting me know that he could stop me whenever he wanted for any reason he invented. Dorothy sat down, and her hands were shaking. The room absorbed this. But before anyone could fully process it, another person stood. This time it was Robert, who owned a small repair shop on Maple Street. He'd opened the shop 5 years ago. He'd borrowed money from his mother. He'd worked 18-hour days to make it successful. He employed 3 people, all from the neighborhood, all people who'd struggled to find steady work. 7 times, Robert said. 7 times in the last year, Officer Simmons has come to my business looking for code violations. He's never found one. But he keeps coming back. Last time he was there, he said something I'll never forget. He said, "Your kind shouldn't be expanding operations around here." Those were his words. Your kind. Robert's voice cracked slightly when he said it. The words stung just as much the second time. The implied message underneath. The threat. The attempt to make him feel that his ambition was transgressive. That building something was not allowed. That staying in his place was the expectation. A woman with a cane who'd been sitting quietly now spoke up. Her name was Margaret, and her voice shook slightly as she spoke. Margaret was a grandmother. She babysat her grandchildren while her daughter worked 2 jobs to support them. She'd raised her own children. She'd raised them to believe in education, to believe in discipline, to believe in the promise of America. He stopped my grandson, 14 years old, walking home from school. Derek made him sit on the curb for an hour while he called in his information to dispatch. My grandson didn't do anything. No crime, no search. Nothing except be young and black and in the wrong place at the wrong time. An hour, Reverend. An hour sitting on a curb because a police officer decided he matched a description. Margaret's voice didn't crack. It hardened. It became the voice of a woman who had seen enough, who was done being reasonable, who was ready to fight. As the stories accumulated, something shifted in the room. This wasn't just about individual incidents anymore. The pattern was becoming visible. The targeting was becoming undeniable. The architecture of the system was being revealed. These weren't random stops. These weren't simple acts of racism from a single bad officer. This was systematic. This was designed. This was intentional. A young woman named Keisha shared her experience. I was followed for 3 blocks by Derek's patrol car. 3 blocks. Finally, he pulled me over and said I had a safety violation. When I asked what that meant, he couldn't explain it. He just made up language, wrote something on a citation, and let me go, knowing that I'd spent my entire evening terrified. Keisha was a student at the university. She was studying engineering. She'd been the first in her family to attend college. She wanted to build things, to use her mind, to contribute something to the world. But Derek had made her terrified to drive in her own neighborhood. An older man named James spoke about his experience at a traffic stop. Derek had demanded to search his vehicle without probable cause, had found nothing but had made sure to use language that no one in the car would forget, including James's youngest daughter. The language of contempt. The language of contempt that teaches young people that their presence is shameful, that their existence is suspect, that they are never welcome. Another congregant, Patricia, described how Derek had stopped her while she was walking, not even driving, just walking. He questioned her about her residence. Her employment made her feel as though simply existing in her neighborhood required justification, as though being black in her own community was itself suspicious. With each story, the reality crystallized. This wasn't an officer having isolated incidents of bad judgment. This was a pattern. This was targeted enforcement. This was someone using a badge to enforce an invisible hierarchy, to remind people of color that their presence in this space, their building of lives, their exercising of authority was subject to his approval, was contingent on his permission, could be revoked at any moment. But that's when the door at the back of the fellowship hall opened. Pastor James from Mount Zion Church entered, followed by 2 members of his congregation. Behind them came Reverend Angela from Grace Community with her own group. Then Pastor David from Mount Carmel, Pastor Lisa from Faith Assembly, Pastor Thomas from Greater Hope. 5 pastors, 5 congregations that had been dealing with the same officer, targeting their communities, harassing their people, creating fear through the weaponization of authority, creating an atmosphere where people couldn't move freely, couldn't build businesses freely, couldn't exercise leadership freely. The fellowship hall fell silent. Then it filled with quiet murmurs of recognition. The scope was expanding. What had seemed like individual incidents was revealing itself as something far larger. 5 churches, multiple congregations, hundreds of people, all targeted by the same officer, all protected by a system that refused to hold him accountable, all trapped in a pattern that they'd individually thought was their responsibility, that they'd individually thought they'd somehow triggered through their own behavior. The pastors came forward and they brought their own documentation. Stories that had been written down, dates that had been recorded, recordings that had been saved, photographs of citations, receipts, evidence that had been carefully preserved because somewhere in the back of each person's mind had been the understanding that someday this evidence might matter. Someday someone might listen. Someday there might be accountability. Pastor James stepped forward. My congregation has experienced the same targeting. Different people, same pattern. When we heard what happened to Reverend Marcus yesterday, we realized we couldn't stay silent anymore. We realized that what we'd been experiencing as individual failures were actually part of something larger. We realized that we had the power to name it, to document it, to demand a response. Reverend Angela spoke next. We've been afraid to come forward individually, but together. Together, we have a voice that can't be ignored. Together, we have numbers. Together, we have documentation. Together, we have the authority of our faith communities. And that's something even Derek Simmons can't dismiss. The meeting transformed from a Bible study into something else entirely. The 5 pastors coordinated comparing notes identifying patterns. Dorothy's broken taillight story connected to a similar incident in Mount Zion. Robert's business harassment connected to an attempted shakedown at a Grace Community member's shop. Margaret's story about her grandson connected to multiple accounts of Derek stopping young people without cause. It was like watching a kaleidoscope turn. All the individual colored pieces suddenly forming into a coherent pattern. A pattern that was unmistakable. A pattern that could no longer be denied. As the documentation accumulated, the evidence became overwhelming. 47 incidents they eventually counted. 47 separate encounters between Officer Derek Simmons and community members, all of whom were black, all of whom lived in neighborhoods near the churches, all of whom had stories of being questioned, detained, harassed, or threatened. One pastor had done research. She'd looked at Derek's complaint history. 13 excessive force complaints in 8 years. 11 involving people of color. Every single one resolved quietly. Through settlements. Through technicalities. Through a system that protected its own. Through mechanisms that were designed to make problems disappear without solving anything. The pattern extended beyond Derek's personal conduct. It involved the entire department. The union that protected him. The supervisors who ignored complaints. The system that benefited from his enforcement. Because Derek's stops had consequences beyond the individual moments. They generated revenue for the city. They justified police presence in these neighborhoods. They created justifications for surveillance. They maintained a kind of social control that benefited people in power. Then someone suggested it. What if we showed up? The question hung in the air. What if we showed up? Not in anger, not in violence, but in presence, in visibility, in numbers. What if we showed up and made it impossible to ignore? What if we showed up and forced a reckoning? Showed up where Marcus asked, though he was beginning to understand. The police station, someone said. All of us. With lawyers. With documentation. With witnesses. What if we just showed up? What if we made it visible? What if we forced the system to respond? The idea crystallized instantly. Not as a threat. Not as aggression. But as presence. As visibility. As a refusal to allow this pattern to continue in the shadows. As a demand that the system account for itself. As an assertion that the church community had power. That numbers mattered. That witness was significant. That you couldn't silence 500 people. By Thursday evening, they had hired Rebecca Martinez. She was a civil rights attorney with 15 years of experience fighting police departments. She was the kind of attorney that police departments feared. Because Rebecca didn't accept settlements. She didn't accept compromises. She accepted accountability or nothing else. She reviewed the documentation, the statements, the recordings. When she looked up from the files, her face was grim. She'd seen patterns like this before. She'd fought battles like this before. But the magnitude of this particular pattern was significant. 47 incidents. Multiple officers potentially implicated. Institutional protection that went high up the chain of command. This is RICO territory, she said, referring to the Racketeer-Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, which typically applied to organized crime. This isn't just one bad officer. This is institutional protection of predatory behavior. This is a conspiracy. And conspiracies have different consequences than individual crimes. Rebecca mapped out what they were seeing. The pattern of targeting. The departmental protection. The way complaints disappeared into a bureaucratic void. The evidence of deliberate intentional harassment designed to suppress community leadership and black economic activity. The financial incentives that made continued targeting profitable for the city. The mechanisms of institutional protection that ensured accountability never happened. "I'll help you," Rebecca said. "But you need to understand what you're about to do. You're not just challenging an officer. You're challenging a department. You're challenging a city. You're challenging the system itself. And systems don't give up power quietly. Systems fight back. Systems protect themselves. Systems have lawyers and union representatives and political connections. But here's what I also know. Systems are fragile when exposed to light, when bearing witness becomes public, when documentation becomes undeniable, when the cost of protection exceeds the benefit of protection. That's when systems change. That's when institutions recalculate. "When can we go to the police station?" Marcus asked. Rebecca smiled. It wasn't a happy smile. It was the smile of someone who understood the necessity of what was about to happen. It was the smile of someone who'd fought these battles before and understood both the risk and the potential. "Friday morning," she said, 8 a.m., and we make sure the media knows you're coming. This has to be witnessed. Because if it's not witnessed, it will be denied. If it's not documented, it will be minimized. If it's not public, it will be managed quietly. So we make it public. We make sure cameras are there. We make sure that what happens next cannot be hidden." Friday morning arrived with the weight of inevitability. By 7:45 a.m., the parking lot of the Akron Police Department was transforming into something the building's architects had never anticipated. They'd built this building to house authority, to house enforcement, to house a system that was supposed to protect and serve. Instead, it was about to house accountability. And accountability changes the dynamics of buildings. They came in cars, in vans, in church buses decorated with the names of congregations. They came with signs that read, "Community over corruption and accountability now, and we are watching." They came with binders full of documentation. They came with lawyers and cameras and the accumulated weight of 500 people who had decided that silence was no longer an option. News vans from Channel 5, Channel 8, and NBC Local were already setting up. Rebecca had made calls. The media had been alerted. Journalists had been briefed. This couldn't be managed if it couldn't be hidden. This couldn't be minimized if it was public. This couldn't be ignored if it was on television. Marcus arrived at 7:50 a.m. He moved through the crowd, acknowledging people providing presents. He recognized many of them from Bethel Grace. But there were also people from Mount Zion and Grace Community and the other churches. There were teachers and nurses and business owners. There were students and grandparents and parents. There were people who'd been stopped and people who feared being stopped. There were people who'd lost faith in the system and people who were desperate to make the system work. But his mind was working through what was about to happen. They were about to walk into an institution designed to protect itself. They were about to demand accountability from a system built on the assumption that accountability happened internally quietly with no witnesses. They were about to challenge Derek Simmons, and by extension the entire police department, and by even further extension, the entire system of institutional power that had protected Derek and countless others like him. The risk was real. The potential for retaliation was real. The possibility that this could go wrong was real. But so was the possibility that this could work, that visibility could defeat institutional protection, that numbers could overcome authority, that witness could transform systems. At 8:02 a.m., the doors to the police station opened. The crowd moved through those doors in near-perfect silence. Not the silence of submission, not the silence of fear, but the silence of people engaged in sacred work, of people bearing witness, of people in prayer. This was a spiritual moment. This was a moment of collective intention. This was a moment where individual stories were becoming a movement. The 5 pastors led the way, dressed in their clerical attire, carrying binders of evidence. Behind them came Marcus, his wheelchair moving with purpose through the station's lobby. Behind him came the community, teachers, nurses, mechanics, custodians, business owners, students, people whose lives had been disrupted by Derek Simmons's use of authority as a weapon. The police station's front desk sergeant looked up from his work. His face went white. He had clearly been briefed that there would be a crowd, but being briefed and experiencing the physical reality of 500 people filling your workplace were entirely different things. He could feel the weight of their presence, the solidity of their numbers, the impossibility of ignoring them or managing them or dismissing them. Marcus approached the desk. Rebecca Martinez stood beside him, carrying 3 binders of documentation that represented months of analysis. Documents that proved the pattern. Documents that showed the institutional response. Documents that demonstrated that this was not negligence, but choice. "We're filing complaints," Marcus said, his voice steady and clear, "against Officer Derek Simmons. We have documentation of 47 incidents, 47 different community members, targeting, harassment, abuse of authority, discriminatory enforcement." He paused. The sergeant was reaching for his phone. "And we're filing simultaneously with the FBI," Marcus continued. "Federal civil rights violations, institutional protection of predatory conduct. We expect a federal inquiry to be announced by this afternoon." The sergeant's hand froze. He understood in that moment that this wasn't a standard complaint process. This was institutional exposure. This was the department being held accountable in public with witnesses, with media documentation. This was a moment where the normal mechanisms of institutional protection were not going to work. "I need to get the captain," the sergeant stammered. "Please do," Marcus said calmly, "and let him know that the media is here, that federal notification is imminent, and that what's about to happen is being documented." Within minutes, Captain Michael Rodriguez appeared. He took in the scene with experienced eyes. He saw the crowd. He saw the cameras. He saw Rebecca Martinez, whose face he recognized from 2 previous civil rights lawsuits against his department. He saw the binders of evidence. He saw the moment his institution stopped controlling the narrative. His jaw clenched. "We need to talk in my office," he said to Marcus. "No," Marcus replied. "We're talking here, in front of witnesses, in front of the media, in front of your department. Because what we have to say is not a secret. It's a public matter. And the public is here." Captain Rodriguez understood in that moment that he had no negotiating position. The old playbook was no longer available. Get the complainant in a private office. Manage the narrative. Resolve it quietly through settlement and union protection. There were cameras. There were witnesses. There were 500 people bearing testimony. There was no managing this. There was no hiding this. There was no minimizing this. Rebecca Martinez stepped forward. She opened the first binder and began to speak. "Officer Derek Simmons has used his badge as a weapon against this community for 8 years. This documentation includes 47 separate incidents, 47 individuals targeted, 89% of them Black or Latina. The pattern is not coincidental. It is institutional." She moved through the evidence with methodical precision. She showed the dashboard camera footage. She played recordings where Derek could be heard using derogatory language. She presented the financial analysis showing that Derek's traffic stops and citations generated revenue that flowed to the city. creating an incentive for continued targeting, creating a financial motivation for harassment. But what's more significant, Rebecca continued, is your department's response. 13 complaints filed against this officer. Every single one resolved quietly. Through union settlements, through technicalities, through an institutional choice to protect an officer rather than protect the community. Your department chose. This wasn't negligence. This was choice. She turned to face the cameras directly. This is not negligence. This is choice. Your police department chose to protect an officer who was predating on community members, chose to hide complaint patterns, chose to enable continued abuse, chose to allow his behavior to persist, chose to sacrifice community safety for institutional protection. And you made that choice repeatedly. Over 8 years, over 13 complaints, over 47 documented incidents, you made the choice. Every single time. The lobby had fallen completely silent. Even the police officers, who had probably been instructed to remain professional, seemed to absorb the weight of what was being articulated. There was no ambiguity here. There was no gray area. There was just choice. Institutional choice to protect power over protecting people. Then the pastor stepped forward. One by one they testified. Pastor James from Mount Zion described the targeting his congregation had experienced, the young men who'd been pulled over without cause, the businesses that had been harassed, the atmosphere of suspicion that had been created. Reverend Angela from Grace Community spoke about the harassment of her members, about the way that Derek's presence in the community had created fear, about the way that fear had spread through the congregation like a virus. Pastor David from Mount Carmel shared the fear that Derek's presence created in their neighborhoods, about children being afraid to walk home from school, about families being afraid to drive to church. Pastor Lisa from Faith Assembly talked about the impact on young people, about the internalization of shame, about the learned helplessness that comes from being targeted by authority. Pastor Thomas from Greater Hope testified about how Derek's actions undermined their work in the community, about how it's hard to build community trust when the police department is actively destroying it, about how difficult it is to teach young people to respect authority when authority is disrespecting them. After the pastors came the community members themselves. Dorothy spoke about her broken taillight that wasn't broken, about being questioned as though her very presence required justification, about the humiliation of being treated as suspect in her own community. Her voice didn't break, but the weight was there, the burden of having to explain, having to prove, having to justify her existence. Robert described the 7 visits to his shop, the veiled threats, the "your kind shouldn't be expanding" comment that had been so calculated in its malice. The message underneath, the attempt to make him feel that ambition was transgressive, that building something meant stepping out of line. Margaret described her grandson sitting on a curb for an hour, humiliated, traumatized, learning the lesson that a police officer could stop you for no reason other than the color of your skin, learning that your presence in your own neighborhood was suspect, learning early that the world was not safe for him. Keisha shared her experience of being followed, of fabricated violations, of having her evening contaminated by fear, of understanding that her safety could not be taken for granted, that existing while black meant being subject to harassment. James talked about the search without probable cause, about his daughter witnessing what authority could do when it was divorced from justice, about the damage done to a child when the person who's supposed to protect her instead threatens her. Patricia spoke about being stopped while walking, about being questioned as though she didn't belong in her own neighborhood, about the message that her presence required explanation, that her movements required justification, that she was not welcome in her own community. One by one they came forward. The accumulated weight of individual stories transformed into something undeniable. This wasn't about isolated incidents. This was about a pattern. This was about an institution that knew about the pattern and chose to protect it. This was about power being exercised not for the purposes of justice, but for the purposes of control, for the purposes of maintaining hierarchy, for the purposes of enforcing an invisible social order. Captain Rodriguez's face had gone through a transformation. Initially resistant, then calculating, then something else. The dawning recognition that his institution had a choice to make. And the choice was no longer between quietly resolving a complaint and fighting it. The choice was between institutional survival and institutional destruction. Because if the department didn't respond appropriately, the federal government would respond. If the department didn't hold Derek accountable, the courts would. If the department didn't change, it would be changed. The pressure was now too great, the exposure too complete, the consequences too significant. Rebecca delivered her final statement. Officer Simmons has 48 hours to resign, or this department will be subject to federal investigation under civil rights statutes. Additionally, this community is prepared to file civil litigation against the city. Your choice is whether this resolves with minimal institutional exposure or maximum exposure, whether you show some accountability or no accountability, whether you change or whether change is forced upon you. She paused. Personally, I recommend you make the right choice. Captain Rodriguez looked at the 500 people, looked at the cameras, looked at the binders of evidence, looked at the faces of the pastors, looked at the faces of the people Derek had targeted, looked at the journalists with their cameras and their notebooks, looked at the future spreading out before him in all its complexity. And he said words that Marcus heard as institutional capitulation. I will personally ensure these complaints are thoroughly investigated. It was bureaucratic language. It was the language of someone who understood that Derek Simmons was already lost. And the question was only whether the department would try to protect him further and risk complete institutional collapse, or whether they would abandon him to save themselves. The question was never really whether Derek would face accountability. The question was whether the institution would face accountability. And that answer was no. The institution was protecting itself. But the cost of that protection had become Derek's career. As Marcus and the pastors and the 500 people turned to leave the police station, something began. A sound, a voice, one person singing. We shall overcome. One voice became two, two became five, five became 50. By the time the crowd reached the doors, 500 voices were singing, not in anger, in testimony, not in celebration, in witness, not as individuals, as a movement. The song echoed through the police station. It echoed through the lobby. It echoed through the hallways. It was the sound of people who had been silenced choosing to speak. The sound of people who had been victimized choosing to become agents of their own liberation. The sound of a community asserting its own power. Derek Simmons stood in the hallway of the police station he'd worked in for 8 years, wearing a uniform that no longer protected him. Listening to 500 people sing about overcoming, he understood in that moment that he had lost, not because he'd been arrested, not because a lawyer had confronted him with evidence, but because his victims had stopped being victims. They had become a movement, and movements reshape institutions. Derek Simmons resigned on Monday morning, not because he wanted to, because the institutional protection that had sustained him for 8 years had evaporated the moment Captain Rodriguez made his calculation. Derek's career, built on the assumption that he could operate within institutional shadows, ended in public light. By Wednesday, the police department announced a comprehensive review of enforcement practices. By the following Friday, the FBI opened a formal investigation into the police department's conduct. The investigation's scope was expansive. Enforcement patterns, complaint handling, the financial incentives that had created Derek's targeting of specific neighborhoods, the institutional mechanisms that had protected him. 3 other officers were reassigned pending investigation. Their complaint histories, which had previously been managed quietly, were suddenly relevant. Their conduct was suddenly scrutinized. The system that had protected them was fracturing under federal pressure. Within a month, Akron had established a civilian oversight board with 5 community members and subpoena power. Mandatory body cameras were implemented with 72-hour public release of footage. The quota system that had incentivized Derek's targeting was formally banned. Annual bias training became a requirement for all officers. The reforms weren't perfect. The system hadn't transformed overnight into something just, but something had shifted. Accountability was now a possibility. Visibility was now a mechanism of control. Institutions could no longer operate in shadows. 3 weeks after the police station appearance, Marcus returned to Rosie's diner. He sat in his usual booth. Susan brought his coffee without being asked. When she set it down, she smiled. Her smile was different now. More solid. More secure. Like she'd discovered something about herself that she'd needed to discover. On the house, she said, "For being brave." Marcus shook his head gently. "I wasn't brave. I just refused to disappear. My community refused to let me. That's where bravery comes from, not from individual heroism, from collective refusal, from people standing together and saying not anymore." Susan understood what he meant. Bravery wasn't an individual quality. Bravery was what happened when people decided collectively that the cost of silence was higher than the risk of speaking. That witness was worth the vulnerability. That community was worth the commitment. Marcus drank his coffee in peace. But not naive peace. Watchful peace. He understood that Derek's resignation didn't mean racism was solved. Understood that other officers still carried bias. Understood that other police departments still protected predators. Understood that the system that had protected Derek for 8 years was the same system that continued to protect countless others. Understood that the victory in Akron was partial, was fragile, was dependent on continued vigilance. But in Akron, one community had proved something significant. Visibility defeats institutional protection. Collective witness defeats individual authority. When victims transform into movements, institutions must adapt or collapse. The congregation at Bethel Grace had grown, not because Marcus was famous, but because the story had gotten out. Other communities, hearing what had happened, reached out wanting to understand how 5 churches had mobilized 500 people to demand accountability. Marcus became not a symbol of individual victory, but a symbol of what becomes possible when community refuses silence. When people refuse to accept injustice. When community acts collectively instead of individually. Derek Simmons is gone from the Akron Police Department, but the system remains. Other officers still carry the capacity for abuse. Other departments still protect predators. Other Black communities still face targeting and harassment and the weaponization of authority. The victory in Akron is real, but it is also partial. The battle won, but the war continuing. Yet something shifted that Friday morning in the police station lobby. Not because one man stood up, because 500 people stood with him. Not because a lawyer filed papers. Because a community testified publicly. Not because the system suddenly became just. Because bearing witness became impossible to ignore. Marcus Williams continues his pastoral work at Bethel Grace Church. He continues knowing every parishioner's name. He continues showing up at hospital beds at 3 in the morning. He continues being present when families fall apart. He continues being present when hope emerges from despair. But now his congregation understands something about itself, understands its own power, its own voice, its own capacity to reshape institutions, understands that collective action accomplishes what individual action cannot, understands that witness is power. If you've been targeted by authority, if you've been harassed or stopped without cause, or made to feel that your presence requires justification, you don't need to face it alone. Your community is there, even if you haven't met them yet. the people who share your experience, the people who share your identity, the people who understand what you've experienced. They exist. You just need to speak. You just need to connect. You just need to refuse isolation. The moment you speak, the moment you refuse to disappear, the moment you refuse silence, that's when community mobilizes. That's when movement begins. Justice doesn't come from above. Justice doesn't come from institutions that have no incentive to provide it. Justice comes from beside, from people standing next to each other, from people refusing to accept injustice, from people deciding that the cost of speaking is less than the cost of silence. Movements don't start with institutions. Institutions don't voluntarily give up power. Movements start with people who decide that silence costs more than speaking. That witness is worth the risk. That community is worth the faith. That accountability is worth fighting for. What happened in Akron could happen anywhere. It starts with one person refusing to accept injustice. It grows when that person's community refuses to accept injustice. It becomes a movement when 500 people show up bearing witness. It reshapes institutions when visibility makes continuance impossible. And movements. Movements are what change institutions. This is how things change. This is always how they change. One person stands, a community gathers, and suddenly power that seemed absolute becomes fragile. Institutions that seemed protected become vulnerable. Systems that seemed permanent become subject to change. If this story meant something to you, subscribe to our channel. Because these stories matter. Because witness is essential. Because the next person being targeted deserves to know that community exists. That resistance is possible. That movements are real. That 500 people showing up together can reshape the institution that was supposed to protect them, but instead violated them. Your voice matters. Your refusal to look away matters. Your willingness to show up for others matters. Because justice doesn't come from power reaching down. Justice comes from people standing beside each other and saying, "Not on our watch, not in our community, not anymore." That's what happened in Akron. And that's what can happen anywhere when people refuse to accept injustice.